Born in Roswell, New Mexico, so I always kid my grandkids that I'm an alien. But obviously, I was raised in Pueblo, Colorado. Moved there when I was 3 years old, and then have been in Colorado consistently over the last 78 years since that time. I took a break to go to the Marine Corps, and during the Vietnam War. But basically, my background is I have a bachelor's degree is in rehabilitation services and special ed, and I also have a master's in rehabilitation. But I also have where I met Dr. Hoffman is that he was one of my instructors during my MBA program at University of Northern Colorado. So we go back 30 years probably. Okay. So that's kind of my background. As a college undergraduate, I started out in engineering, and then after 2 years of engineering, I switched to psychology. And so maybe that was my motivation to work with people. So that would probably be a real motivation to have worked at Fort Logan Mental Hospital in the Children's Division. That's where I started out after coming home from the Marine Corps. Working up through the system. I started out as a psychiatric technician, and then over a period of time, I just kept working up in the system until I was an assistant director in Adams County, and just sort of phased in at some point. They appointed me a director, and that's how I got there. It wasn't, again, it was 10, 15 years of just working and working for different agencies and education, training, and just kind of moved up. The one thing about executive directors, which in the whole concept of nonprofits and social services agencies, that's kind of a normal title. If you, like you were mentioning that you were involved in potentially social work. If you were at the Department of Social Services, you'll probably run into a lot of agencies and a lot of people, whether it's Goodwill Industries or a health program, we'll usually have executive directors. In the other world, in the business world, they don't have those titles. Basically, they might have a director, but those directors are always under chief executive officers, chief operating officers, chief financial officers. So when we merged and created the Annie Ann's process, the one big sort of quick change that had to come was I needed to change my title from executive director to president and CEO. So the last 10 or 15 years of my career, I was actually called a president and chief executive officer, not an executive director. I started out at Platte River. State of Colorado, like a lot of organizations in, a lot of states in the United States, really didn't have services for the most severely disabled folks. So when we say that, back in my career beginning in the mid-60s, they actually separated people that had mental retardation in not very positive terms, but they had them in trainable mentally retarded and educable mentally retarded. So if you were an educable mentally retarded person, you were in the public schools and the special ed programs. If you were less than educable, you were in the trainable, you were in the institution like Ridge Homes or the state hospital or just at home in the community. So excuse me, in the 60s, a person named Joe Calabrese, who was a state senator at that time, had two mentally retarded children, one named Larry, one named Don. So if you Google the historical and really first functional large program for severely mentally retarded people was called Laridan, and it's still called that, Laridan Hall. And I think the hall has been dropped. It's now just down to Laridan. So as a state senator, he created a bill that was called the Community Center Board for Mentally Retarded and Seriously Handicapped Individuals, the CCB system. That became a state-funded process that went through. If you know, the state of Colorado has a thing called the Long Bill. Most people are not too familiar with how when the Joint Budget Committee comes out with a bill, it's called the Long Bill. It has nothing to do with any kind of any name or any person or whatever it is. You can just tell how simple Colorado is. The Long Bill is called the Long Bill because it's long. There's no other reason for it except it's long. So every year in May, the state of Colorado passes the Long Bill right downtown here on 14th and 13th. That bill encompasses all the services and programs of the state of Colorado. So the Community Center Board then became a direct funding element of the state of Colorado. So when I left Fort Logan Mental Hospital, I went to work for Denver Board for the severely mentally retarded, and then I went to Adams County for the severely mentally retarded. And every county had that title. There was the Jefferson County Center, and there was the Arapahoe County. Everybody's changed their names now because, again, marketing, that wasn't politically acceptable, which is another thing that happens in nonprofits. Over the years, names become evolved because you're trying to compete in a market that you don't want to walk into the office and the first thing they hear is, I'm from the Denver Board for the severely mentally retarded. You probably won't get a meeting. So in Denver now, it's called Denver Options. Okay, so each county has modified their names so that they are able to deal with that. But that's just how that mentally retarded aspect of the state developed. And I kind of started in the early 60s with that and kind of evolved through that whole process. And so Platte River Industries is really was just a funded Community Center Board program and the city and county mill levy money. So that's what Platte River Industries Inc. actually was. We were just a subsidiary, technically, agency of the Community Center Board. So every year our funding came from the state. That money from the state, historically, starting in the 60s, was matched by an annual Medicaid funding from the federal government. And it still does have that link between the federal government and the Long Bill. That stream is where the funding services for mentally retarded folks and developmentally disabled folks in the state of Colorado get their funding from. When I first became a employee of the system, the state of Colorado was like the 10th best funded program in the United States, the 10th state. We had tremendous money when I first came in the 20s. By the time I left the field, and over the last, say, 10 or 15 years that I was in the field, the state of Colorado was normally 48th, 47th, 46th in funding. So our funding disappeared pretty much right after the Reagan administration had gone out of the government. So the highest funding period of time in my whole career that we had was during the Reagan administration, and that was because he had an assistant, a secretary of Education and Special Ed, was named Madeline Will. Her husband is more famous as a conservative newscaster and named George Will. But they had, even though they were divorced, had a disabled, mentally retarded child. So when she took over the department, she was the person who was responsible for the concept of supportive employment and the concept of school to work transition, and also the concept that mentally retarded people should not be isolated. So that was the beginning of closing institutions like Ridge and Pueblo State. That was the beginning of special ed public schools being forced to have specific classes for the special ed kids. And in the lower functioning, which was the trainable, before they dropped all those titles, the agencies that were like community center boards provided services for them in the state of Colorado. So my whole career was at that end of the trainable mentally retarded and the dual diagnosed individuals, which primarily is a person who might have a mental health issue, might have seizures, might have a combination of cerebral palsy. So my career was in that bailiwick. So that group of individuals very seldom had enough funds to receive the services that they wanted. But in the beginning, they were in church basements. I left Fort Logan to come to Denver, had a pay raise from going to the state to the county. But my first 2 years as a teacher in the DD system was at the Mennonite Church off of 8th Avenue in Denver, close to Denver General. So there's a Mennonite church here. We had about 50 mentally retarded really in that church basement. And then we progressed, and that agency became pretty much the Denver board that actually became the large CCB from that point. So that's kind of where my career came from. In that process of learning about the lower functioning individuals, where I really got my background and knowledge of what to do and what their capacity and capabilities were. So over the years, by the time I got, say, promoted to in Adams County is the adult director of their programs. My really first, what you could call a social enterprise, was within the nonprofit Sheltered Workshop environment. So Sheltered Workshop, we call rehabilitation centers or work centers, was just a large community organization that normally housed somewhere from 100 to 200 persons with disabilities. So it was Goodwill Industries, Laird Hall, Shalom of Denver, Hope Center. All of us were all in that same, we provided services. Those services were usually restricted to academic type things, keeping people busy, not having anything except primarily supposedly having interesting days and stuff. Pretty early in my career, I thought that was kind of a waste of their time. So at one point, we bought a toy company that from Canyon City. They were making small wooden toys. And we bought the company and created what we call Timberline Toys. And so that was our first experience in dealing with the commercial world and dealing with selling products and dealing with the whole business aspect. The toy company, my envisioning was just for those individuals who I thought could do some specific tasks. In the beginning, that everybody in Adams County freaked because we had table saws, we had radial arm saws, we had paint booths, we had all that so-called dangerous equipment. And over all the years that we ran Timberline Toys, which was about 5 years, not one person with disability ever cut a finger off or lost a hand or whatever, because you had to create what we call jigs to make sure they were safe. So at the same time we were doing Timberline Toys, which we sold in pretty much the small gift shops in most hotels around the United States. So that was kind of my big beginning of going out and venturing out to do trade shows and gift shows. So we'd go out and present the toys, just like any other business, and we would get so many sales and we'd come back. Well, that kind of went along pretty well until one year, the second year probably, we were making these really complex, beautiful wooden toys, trucks, trains, all this other kind of stuff. And we got a call from Target. And so I went into the meeting with Target. They requested that we make 25,000 toys in the month of December. So that's when I also learned that there was a capacity with which you could come up with in a market niche. So those are kind of the learning processes of when you go into a business. Now, Lynn and I will both tell one of the questions on your list there is, what does it take to run a nonprofit, and what does it take to run a my phone's ringing too, a social enterprise? And what it takes, number one, is cash. If you don't have reserve, if you don't have funds invested, you will not be successful. There's nothing, and after all the years that we finally were in business, the thing that finally killed us is the end was United Airlines and Concourse B going bankrupt, which then subsequently, just like we're going through with the virus now, subsequently sort of killed all the concessionaires in Concourse B. And we went from making $1.2 million a year in just the one store in Concourse B within 9 months in 2008 down to 600,000. So that kind of cash drain killed us, just like it killed numerous other businesses at that time. Bennigan's, people wonder, what happened to Bennigan's? They just went out of business so fast. We went out of business at the same time, the same year. Computer City or Computer, I forgot whatever the other business, they went out at the same time. So right now, the virus is duplicating what happened in 2007, 2008. Now, we didn't really die until 2010, but 2011, but that's all of a sudden, our stream of money that was very fluid for years just dried up when United Airlines was going through their bankruptcy. Because we had committed our Annie Ann store in the airport to Concourse B, and that's where United Airlines was at. And that was our extra money in our social enterprise. Even though we had Annie Ann stores, and so you have a lot of outside interference or conditions that you have no control over. We got stores at South Glen Mall, which now is University Mall. I think it's what it's called. It's where, but it's at that time it was called South Glen Mall. When they decided to tear that mall down and rebuild it and make it more of a non-enclosed mall, which became the norm in the United States. Enclosed malls disappeared and have been disappearing. Our store that we built in Aurora is still there at the Aurora Town Center, up on the second floor by the Annie Ann's there, which was, that's really the last pretty much enclosed mall that was built in Colorado, that was revised and built. We also had the Southwest Mall, which is way out. So we had Annie Ann stores in Southwest, South Glen, Aurora, and two stores in the airport, one in the terminal and one in the concourse. The two stores in the airport, which we took over the one store in 1998 from Annie Ann's as it became a franchisee. In 2001, unfortunately, just at the time of the tragedy, we had just opened this store in the terminal. Now that store in the terminal was a spinoff or continuation from our first business in the airport, which was called Rocky Popcorn. And it was just a little small popcorn store, online popcorn store in the terminal, which was our first big break that the city and county gave us to put an operation in. So Annie Ann's, after we've gotten Annie Ann's business, we converted that business into a pretzel store. That's kind of an interesting question because I'm not sure that there is a need to go into it or not. And that probably doesn't make any sense being involved in it forever, but nonprofits, and for-profit entities that are going to provide services to me, are kind of on an equal plane. You can create a for-profit entity, and you might be able to be more successful because it depends what kind of market niche you were going into. But if you were to create a for-profit entity that was providing medical services, a doctor, but some kind of spin-off of parallel businesses towards that, and you were doing that for profit. Historically, I don't really believe they are that, but Blue Cross Blue Shield, Athens, and stuff is supposed to be a nonprofit business. If you look in their charter and their creation, but that obviously is not what they are. They're strictly a bottom line. So I think that there is a path for either one. I don't think that you have to choose one or the other. It would obviously be much easier to be a for-profit with a good bottom line and create a nonprofit as a subsidiary than to be a struggling not-for-profit with not a good financial bottom line to try to create a for-profit entity. Because without, and Lynn will share this with you, Dr. Hoffman, there's just no way that a nonprofit can be successful unless they have a positive cash flow. You have to have a strong bottom line. So all your values and all your missions and all the things that are good for you. My biggest failure as a director, as a president CEO, was holding on to the project at Buckley Air Force Base, which is a concession. For years, the government, before 9/11, the government was a good business partner. Over the years, as the government lost and their budgets diminished and they cut, whether it was in the Department of Education or the Department of Rehabilitation Services or whatever department they were cutting in this case, because we were working with the government, it was the Department of Defense, and actually it was called the Department of Commissaries. But all of those government entities, as they lose money, and you've invested, you have the employees, you have the commitment of equipment, you have equipment and space, you can't recoup that money. And the government, you can never win that debate. I mean, when we closed our agency in 2011, we still have outstanding suits against the government for thousands of dollars that we didn't get paid. And that happens to anybody that's a contractor with the government, because you're only a contractor. So they can, at any point, every contract probably has a 30-day clause in it that says we can terminate our contract with you at any time. And there you're stuck with whatever operation you have. So I maintained operating the commissaries for about a year, when about a year and a half, probably, when I probably should have closed them as soon as they stopped totally funding our operation. But I thought I had 45, 50 people who had been working in the commissaries from 1998, and this was in 2005. And 80% of those were persons with disabilities. They had grown used to making $16 and $17 an hour working in the warehousing. The real seriously disabled people were shelf stocking, which a very severe person can do, because just putting one item on the shelf and that sort of thing. So they were comfortable. They had health insurances. They had retirement plans. They had all of that. My biggest failure was not to terminate and lay them off and shut down that operation once we didn't actually have the funds. We covered them for years with the airport money, with all our other contracts. And as each government entity got into an hassle at one time or another, it really was a thing that pretty much broke our organization. So I still credit that as my biggest failure, not knowing when to, the old country western song, not knowing when to fold. I should have folded much earlier. but that was 40 or 50 people's lives. So, and they had been living that life for 10, 12 years. And a lot of them had to come back into the shelter workshop. A lot of them we tried to replace them in jobs all over, some in the airports, some other places, but all of them didn't make it, because some of the ones who were just say shelf-stockers, that was a low-skilled task in the first place. And so we couldn't get them in King Soopers and stuff. We did start trying to do some contracts with King Soopers and Targets and all those folks, but the environment wasn't the same as it was on the military base, because in the military base, we were the contractor. We did the warehousing, we did the janitorial, we did the shelf stocking. In the other situations, we were just a contractor. We were doing a percentage of it, and we were being supervised by other people. So our folks didn't really have a real strong, positive relationship there. Because as much as we all say, we love the disabled and we want to do, there is a reality that a lot of people don't want to work with disabled persons. And so just the reality of human nature causes a lot of problems for that kind of placement. So that was one of the big things that we got into our mind real early, that we would run any business we were involved in if we could, so that our clients would be protected from the different biases and discrimination of working for some other corporation and stuff. So that was one of the big training elements. And that was the big cross-training elements for those other folks who came to work for us from the for-profit entity, that they had to learn that the quickest way to get fired was to treat one of the persons with disabilities without respect and dignity, because that would get you fired almost immediately. So,